Is it ever gonna be enough? Is it ever gonna be enough?
The United States and Iran struck a ceasefire this month, following nearly 4 months of conflict. The 14-point Memorandum of Understanding was signed on the 17th of June at the Palace of Versailles following a G7 summit. Before we go into the deal itself, we'd like to remind viewers that headlines of peace between Iran and the United States have been prone to flip-flop rapidly and often. With this in mind, we'll be covering the deal as written, knowing full well it could have been torn up and restored by the time you're watching this. The first and perhaps most obvious point in the agreement is the immediate end to the conflict on all fronts. Notably, this explicitly includes respecting the territorial sovereignty of Lebanon, which has been a battleground between Israel and the militant group Hezbollah. This might prove somewhat complicated, as Hezbollah is heavily funded by the Iranian government, and Israel claims to have not even seen the agreement before it was signed. The agreement specifically mentions that allies of the US and Iran are included in the ceasefire, and it's unclear whether these third parties will uphold a deal they didn't sign. The second point states that both Iran and the US will respect each other's sovereignty and internal affairs. This will likely come as a tough pill to swallow for huge segments of the Iranian people, as Iran's government has a well-earned reputation for vicious oppression. The anti-government protests within Iran earlier this year saw the Iranian regime kill anywhere between 7,000 to 36,000 people in an effort to hold on to power. The protest movement was one of many cited reasons President Trump started the war in the first place. The Strait of Hormuz is a big portion of the agreement, with both nations agreeing to immediately start removing any blockades or impediments to the crucial shipping lane. In the longer term, the deal would have Iran and other Gulf nations come to an agreement for how to manage the strait. The US believes that Iran won't attempt to charge tolls for access. This comes as President Trump announced that the US was 4 weeks away from depleting its oil reserves. Perhaps the most contentious point of the plan reads, quote, "The United States undertakes, together with regional partners, to develop a definitive, mutually agreed plan with at least $300 billion United States dollars for the reconstruction and economic development of the Islamic Republic of Iran." The question of who is actually paying for this $300 billion reconstruction fund is currently unclear. President Trump has insisted that no US tax dollars will be contributed to this $300 billion figure. The agreement doesn't specify which countries or whether the private sector will contribute to the fund. With this said, according to a report by Reuters shortly after the agreement was announced, companies based in the US, the Gulf Arab states, Asia, South America, and Africa have already agreed to financing. The reconstruction fund goes hand in hand with the lifting of all economic sanctions on Iran. Iran is the second most sanctioned nation on Earth behind Russia, which has significantly crippled the nation's economy and long stifled foreign investment. Before Iran's falling out with the US in 1979, the country boasted one of the largest and fastest growing economies in the world. Iran is currently home to 92 million people, a huge untapped supply of oil and natural gas, and a massive educated population. With the unfreezing of its assets and significant foreign investment, Iran could once again become an economic powerhouse in the region. This economic boon would all be contingent on Iranian cooperation, however, which means the International Atomic Energy Agency would be required to verify the disposal of enriched uranium. Viewers might draw close comparisons to the Iranian nuclear deal signed by Obama in 2015, which also traded sanctions relief for the dismantling of Iran's nuclear program. President Trump would go on to axe the agreement in 2018, stating that he'd get America a better deal. After 2 separate wars, an oil crisis, and a bunch of Iranian leaders getting assassinated, we finally have that deal. Taking a step back, the agreement is broadly in line with President Trump's Middle Eastern policy during his second term. Upon taking office, the United States has strengthened ties with nations all over the Middle East, largely by brokering deals with American businesses. Unlike previous administrations, President Trump has been more willing to overlook human rights concerns within the region, opting for a more pragmatic economic approach. What all of this means for the future of Iran and the region as a whole is yet to be seen. The Iranian government still remains as one of the most violent regimes on Earth, and conflict within Lebanon continues to threaten the agreement. Optimistically, however, the easing of sanctions and explosion of foreign investment could greatly increase the quality of life for millions of Iranian citizens. For many within Iran, the agreement represents a huge national victory over the largest military on Earth. For others, it's the entrenchment of a brutal regime that killed thousands of its own citizens less than 6 months ago. Both the US and Iran have every reason to want this deal to succeed, so hopefully that will be enough to maintain a lasting peace. For our next story, we wanted to start with a little history lesson. In 1924, Austrian marine scientist Victor Pierre Nemec heard reports of a newly discovered coastal fish in Brazil, the elusive Clearwater Hemlock. Accompanied by his wife Helene, Victor Pierre Nemec traveled by ship to Florianopolis, eager to document this new aquatic animal for himself. However, weeks after arriving at the seaside city, Victor Pierre Nemec grew frustrated in his inability to find his fugitive fish. Sensing his frustration, Helene convinced her husband to take a day off and accompany her to the beach. While Victor and Helene were strolling by the ocean shortly before midday, they noticed a lot of younger men by the beach were preparing to surf. Victor Pierre Nemec had never heard of the sport before, but being a World War I veteran, he wasn't afraid of a little danger. Encouraged by the local men he had just met, as well as his loving wife, Nemec borrowed a board and started paddling out as best he could. After a few minutes of struggling on his crude, heavy board, he found himself in a calm patch of water. It was right there, in the midst of questioning his own impulsiveness, that Victor Pierre Nemec finally saw it. It was the fish he came all the way to Brazil to find, and it was less than a meter from him. Unfortunately for him, he would soon discover that he wasn't the only one searching for the fish in these waters. At that moment, a large shark darted towards the fish, knocking both Nemec and his wooden board violently into the air. When Victor Pierre Nemec regained consciousness on the beach, saved by one of the local men, he asked what had just attacked him. One of the men then shot him a knowing smile, leaned down to Nemec, and said to him, "It was a surf shark VPN." That's right, everyone, we made it all up. There is no Victor Pierre Nemec, there is no Helene, and there was no shark. The only real thing in the story is today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Unlike Victor Pierre Nemec, you don't need to travel months by sea to find what you're looking for. With Surfshark's network of 4,500 servers in all corners of the globe, you can choose to digitally appear anywhere in the world with the push of a button. Surfshark's clean web feature can also turn off ads while you're browsing online, meaning just like Mr. Nemec, you can do what you gotta do without being hassled by the advertisers of today. This also works on YouTube, so if you're looking for an ad-free YouTube experience, Surfshark is a very cheap alternative to YouTube Premium. Surfshark is also an ever-present bodyguard against phishers, trackers, and malware, and upon request can even scan emails for signs of deception. Deception such as naming Nemec's fish the Clearwater Hemlock. We named that shit after a weapon skin for the Hemlock assault rifle in Apex Legends. And we know for a fact that half of our viewers are Titanfall fans. If we can pull off something that stupid, don't think a dastardly hacker couldn't do the same. The good news is that signing up to Surfshark is completely risk-free. Because if you back out within the first 30 days, they'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. To make the deal even sweeter, by going to surfshark.com/SirSwag, using the code SirSwag, or scanning this QR code. You'll also score yourself an extra 4 months on the house. Surfshark VPN, saving you from degenerates like us. Meanwhile, the UK gets its 7th Prime Minister in 10 years. The Taliban look for interns in Germany, and Russia sanctions a 17-year-old for uncovering hundreds of billions in crypto-based sanctions dodging. Swiss citizens rejected a vote this month, which would have limited the country's population to 10 million people. The vote came after a long campaign by the nation's right-wing Swiss People's Party, which has long advocated anti-immigration policies. The party argued that the population cap was designed to protect Switzerland's public services and environment. In recent years, the Swiss public has faced growing concerns with high rents, rising healthcare costs, and crowded public transport, issues that the Swiss People's Party had hoped would tip the scales. However, with a vote of 45% in favour to 55% against, it appears that the majority of Swiss citizens didn't believe a population cap was the answer to these problems. Had the vote been passed, the population would have been capped at 10 million until 2050. If the population hit 9.5 million, the government would immediately restrict all cases of family reunification, residency permits, and asylum. One of the biggest arguments against the proposal is Switzerland's relationship with the European Union. Although not part of the EU EU itself, Switzerland has had a long list of deals that let it function very similarly within the economic bloc. Half of all Swiss products are sold within the European Union, and the nation's access to this market is dependent on Switzerland's commitment to the free movement of people. If the 10 million cap was reached and Switzerland had to close its borders, the consequences could be devastating to the Swiss economy. Countries within the European Union have long warned non-EU nations that they can't just cherry-pick the advantages of the bloc and skirt around the associated commitments. Naturally, the vote drew close comparisons to the UK's decision to leave the EU in 2016, with some dubbing the vote the Swiss Brexit. The UK has quite famously struggled to reorient itself in the wake of leaving the EU, suffering from compounding economic loss, little to no wage growth, and increases in cost of living. Swiss businesses were also generally against the proposal, as a population cap would severely reduce the pool of available workers. Switzerland heavily relies on migrant workers for its health and tourism sectors, where hotels and restaurants have long depended on employing workers from abroad. There's also the looming issue of Switzerland's own safety. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine and America's steady withdrawal from Europe, European nations are becoming increasingly more concerned with their capacity to defend themselves. Switzerland is a relatively small country obsessed with neutrality, but even they can see the value in strengthening relations with their closest defensive allies. With everything the continent has witnessed over the past few years, it certainly pays to have friends in an increasingly unstable world. On the 12th of June, Nino Guerrero, leader of the Venezuelan crime syndicate Tren de Aragua, was killed in a US airstrike. Never one to mince words, US President Donald Trump would announce on Truth Social, quote, "At my direction, the United States Southern Command delivered a swift and lethal kinetic strike to successfully execute Nino Guerrero, the infamous leader of Tren de Aragua, one of the most bloodthirsty terrorist organizations on planet Earth." The assassination of Nino Guerrero kicks off a major side quest in President Trump's second term. On his very first day in office, Mr. Trump signed an executive order declaring Tren de Aragua a terrorist organization, although experts have generally disagreed with this designation, stating that the group is motivated by money and not political ideology. The order has allowed the president to more aggressively target members of the organization. Although a transnational crime syndicate, Tren de Aragua is relatively new in the world of organized crime. Initially founded as a Venezuelan prison gang in 2014, the gang would become so powerful that it would effectively take control of the Tocaron prison, which would become the organization's headquarters. At its height, prisoners could roam freely around the grounds, and the gang even initiated significant construction projects. Amenities included a swimming pool, a nightclub, several restaurants, a children's play area, a baseball field, and a small zoo housing flamingos and an ostrich. When the Venezuelan government eventually took back the prison in 2023, they sent 11,000 troops to shut it down. Although Tocaron prison was intended to house 750 inmates, the population had ballooned to twice that by the time of the raid. Although generally outnumbering the prisoners, the Venezuelan military had plenty of cause for concern. After the raid, military personnel found 16 firearms, 15 self-propelled rockets, 40 anti-tank grenades, and 80 kilos of C4. They also found a 5-kilometer concrete framed tunnel network complete with lighting and ventilation, where prisoners could come and go as they pleased. This is why none of the senior members of Tren de Aragua, including Nino Guerrero, were captured in the raid. Although a major setback, the criminal organization has continued to deal in extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking, robbery, and even setting up illegal mining operations. The US airstrike to kill Nino Guerrero came after a long campaign by President Trump to crack down on the organization. Many have praised President Trump for holding such an aggressive stance against the vicious criminal group. However, critics have stated that the president's anti-cartel crusade has caused an unacceptable level of collateral damage. In March 2025, President Trump invoked the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, a law which allows the president to detain and expel citizens of a country at war with the United States. The law was quite famously used to hold thousands of German and Japanese citizens in concentration camps during World War II. The act was used to deport roughly 200 Venezuelan nationals, all accused of being members of Tren de Aragua, although legal scholars have questioned whether this was within the president's power. The Sedition Act only covers threats from a government or nation, which doesn't qualify Tren de Aragua. The president might have been able to justify the deportations for a 2-hour and 28-minute window in January this year. This is because you might be able to argue that the US was briefly at war with Venezuela while it captured former President Nicolas Maduro. However, even then, of the roughly 200 Venezuelans deported, only 19 had criminal records. The Trump administration has also airstriked a series of boats they claim to have been carrying drugs, some of which are said to be linked to Tren de Aragua. Since September 2025, over 200 people have been killed in such airstrikes. Some legal experts believe that these operations violate international law, as it targets civilians without offering them due process. The US military has not provided any evidence that the attacked boats had carried drugs or drug smugglers. With President Trump being roughly a year and a half into his 4-year term, America's stance against criminal organizations isn't likely to change anytime soon. Only time will tell whether Mr. Trump's ends justify the means style of enforcement will be celebrated or frowned upon when the history books of his presidency are eventually written. On the 9th of June, NASA announced the mission plan and crew for the Artemis III mission, the final major step before a return to a crewed moon landing. Building off the success of the Artemis I and II missions, Artemis III will test critical systems and practice docking maneuvers between the Orion spacecraft and the 2 separate lunar lander systems. Scheduled to launch in late 2027, the mission will last 2 weeks and will be the final major step before a crewed moon landing is attempted in early 2028. With this in mind, let's meet the crew. Commanding the team is Randy Comrade Bresnik. Bresnik is a former Marine fighter jet pilot and test pilot. Bresnik previously flew to the ISS aboard a space shuttle in 2009, and again later in 2017 on a Russian Soyuz rocket. Bresnik has 32 hours of spacewalk experience, and has served as both flight engineer and commander of the ISS. Since 2018, he's been astronaut-in-chief of the Astronaut Officer's Exploration Division, gaining valuable experience in the design and testing of Artemis equipment. This will be his 3rd spaceflight. Stepping in as pilot is Luca Parmitano, an Italian astronaut from the European Space Agency. Parmitano is a former fighter jet pilot and electronic warfare officer. Parmitano was previously launched to the ISS in 2013, spending 166 days aboard. He then made a second trip on July 20, 2019, exactly 50 years after the first moon landing. During his second stay, Parmitano served as the ISS commander and has over 33 hours of spacewalk experience. Notably, on one of his spaceflights, Parmitano nearly drowned after his spacesuit sprung a water leak in his helmet, though he safely returned to the station and undid his helmet. Fortunately, he didn't claim the title of the first unlucky bastard to somehow drown in space. This will be his 3rd spaceflight, and the first European astronaut assigned to an Artemis mission. The first mission specialist is Andre Douglas. Douglas is a Coast Guard veteran and holds a PhD in systems engineering, as well as a master's degree in electrical engineering, computer engineering, mechanical engineering, marine engineering, and naval architecture. We suspect at this point he's just collecting degrees for fun. Douglas was selected as an astronaut in 2021 and began his astronaut duties in 2022. Douglas served as crew backup for the Artemis II mission, training alongside 4 astronauts. This will be his first spaceflight. The other mission specialist is Frank Rubio. Rubio holds a doctorate of medicine and a bachelor's in international relations. He's also a former Black Hawk helicopter pilot and flight surgeon. As a doctor, pilot, and astronaut, we don't envy Rubio's siblings. Rubio was launched to the ISS in 2022, spending 371 consecutive days in space, the current NASA record holder. This will be his 2nd spaceflight. Viewers may note that this crew is all male, which came with some controversy. Currently, the NASA astronaut corps consists of 22 men and 15 women. Responding to criticism, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman stated, quote, "The astronaut office assigns the crew that gives the mission the best chance of meeting its objectives, taking into account many factors, including the background and expertise of the astronauts, such as test pilot experience, development work on specific programs, and availability. Since 2023, NASA has also promised that the first woman and person of color will be landed on the moon, although this promise has since disappeared from NASA's Artemis homepage. Some speculate that this may have been the result of President Trump's anti-DEI push. Isaacman refuted this, however, saying that crew selection mission does not involve any political appointees. Isaacman also pointed out that not every astronaut is available for selection for various reasons. Some astronauts may already be committed to another spaceflight mission, such as being sent to the ISS. Alternatively, some astronauts are held in reserve if NASA believes their skills more closely align with another upcoming mission. As for the mission itself, Artemis III will involve 3 separate rockets launching 3 spacecraft. First, Blue Origin will launch their Blue Moon Mark II lander into orbit around Earth and position it in advance of the crew's launch. Subsequently, Artemis III's crew will launch aboard a slightly modified Space Launch System (SLS) rocket. The crew will then dock with the Blue Moon lander and enter it while wearing new spacesuits designed by Axiom in conjunction with fashion house Prada. The suits themselves look like level 15 Battle Pass skins, the kind of shit that only just justify an epic rarity. Here's hoping the Artemis IV crew will have unlocked the Hit the Gritty emote in time to touch down on the moon. After the Artemis III crew dock with the lander and run systems tests, the crew will begin performing practice maneuvers and experiments. While this is occurring, SpaceX will launch their Human Landing System, HLS, to rendezvous with the crew in orbit. After testing is concluded, the astronauts will undock from the Blue Moon to return to their Orion capsule, and then dock with the HLS. The HLS is not planned to have operational life support systems on board yet, so astronauts won't enter it, but will still perform maneuver practice and test other critical systems. Once testing of the HLS is concluded, Orion will undock and maneuver for the deorbiting burn back to Earth. The crew will then splash down off the coast of California before being scooped up by the US Navy. The mission is estimated to take approximately 14 days, although there's flexibility for more or less time should the mission require. Artemis III is planned to launch no earlier than late 2027, with assembly and stacking of the rocket already underway. However, the whole mission is still just a dress rehearsal for the main event, Artemis IV, the return to the moon. Scheduled to launch in early 2028, Artemis IV will bring 2 astronauts to the lunar surface for the first time since the 1970s. Later that same year, Artemis V will bring 2 more astronauts to the surface and begin the construction of a permanent base on the moon. Artemis V is currently the last planned Artemis mission, but NASA is almost certainly planning the next steps to humanity's first permanent presence on the moon. Although NASA rejected our request to send Jack the intern to the moon, we plan to continue our Artemis coverage as long as it takes. The Canadian province of Alberta has witnessed a growing separatist movement in recent times, which seeks to separate the region from the rest of the country. Unfortunately, the movement has been the target of opportunistic foreign engagement farmers, who seek to use the divisive issue as a way to generate more revenue. Alberta's rise in separatist sentiment was most recently demonstrated on the 4th of May, when 300,000 signatures were formally submitted to launch a referendum for independence. Alberta itself has had a long history of independence movements within the province, which started gaining traction in the 1980s. Alberta's oil industry makes up a huge chunk of revenue for the Canadian government. However, it proportionately has much less voting power compared to the nation's eastern states. Many residents feel that its lower population leaves the region disenfranchised among the more populated Ontario and Quebec provinces, which tends to vote for more progressive anti-oil policies. Although this is the first time that the Alberta separatist movement has generated enough support to initiate a referendum, its overall popularity remains relatively low, as at the start of June, polling within Alberta put separatist support at 19% in favour and 72% against. As mentioned, the long-running contentiousness of Alberta separatism has made it a prime target for engagement farmers. An investigation by CBC News uncovered at least 14 Facebook accounts operated by non-Canadian foreigners posing as Canadian citizens. Related accounts were primarily from Indonesia, Pakistan, India, the United States, and Sri Lanka. The outrage farmers, gathering thousands of views, were primarily motivated by Meta's monetization system, which pays users for high engagement posts. One such poster, an Indonesian noodle merchant, shared her revenue from engagement farming the Alberta separatist movement, which made her as much as $13.89 a month. A much larger operation was Street Politics Canada, an engagement farm operating from Egypt. The now banned accounts previously racked up 10 million views on YouTube, mostly by farming anti-Justin Trudeau content. Commenting on these entrepreneurial ventures, Renee DeResta, an associate research professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., would state, quote, "It's low-cost content production. It is something that allows them to earn some extra money, which really makes a difference in some parts of the world. What Meta is doing is incentivizing users to find issues that people believe in deeply, that people feel deeply aggravated about, and to manipulate those audiences for profit. Meta has a responsibility to enforce its authenticity and monetization rules. It's important to keep in mind that Alberta's political situation is just the latest target of online engagement farmers. Another Facebook page called Great British People generated 20 million views by using AI to stoke anti-immigration sentiment, while the page itself was run by a user in Sri Lanka. In nearly all cases, the topic of these accounts is irrelevant to engagement farmers. Researchers have even found evidence of accounts testing the waters on both sides of an issue to find which stances generate more online traction. The attention economy and the rise of AI has now made engagement farming a potentially profitable enterprise in less developed nations. This has been a departure from the more traditional state-sanctioned propaganda campaigns, which are usually run to achieve political goals or to stoke division. According to US intelligence, Russia has launched significant online efforts to help Donald Trump's election campaigns, while Iran ran an operation to get Biden into power. Considering America's relationship with both nations at the moment, we probably don't have to explain their motivations. Meanwhile, the United States ran a clandestine PSYOPs campaign between 2020 and 2021, designed to discredit China's Sinovac vaccine. Another example is Russia posing as activists on both sides of the Black Lives Matter movement in an effort to sow division and to create mistrust of US institutions. Although many examples of what we mentioned were caught and taken down, trying to counter engagement farming can be particularly challenging. A person in America could pretty easily pose as someone from the UK, and they'd only reasonably be caught if they started measuring distances with football fields. Content moderation has also become increasingly more difficult, as rapid strides in AI has made detecting artificial posts harder with every passing day. When we spoke to a former member within one of America's PSYOPs divisions earlier this year, they lamented the AI sloppification of the profession. As funny as that sounds, they do have a point. Chinese revolutionary propaganda gave the world some genuinely incredible art, which has unfortunately been replaced by a firehouse of low-quality AI-generated Facebook posts. Internal policies within these platforms have also made it easier to stoke outrage, with both Facebook and Twitter loosening their restrictions for what they allow users to post. YouTube, however, might just be the worst offender, as nearly its entire moderation infrastructure is run by AI. Ironically, when this channel was hacked in late 2024, we found that paying for bots on Twitter was one of the only ways to get human eyes on the problem. We can only expect that within the next 10 years, the entire internet will just be bots rage-baiting other bots for increasingly smaller shreds of ad revenue. A big problem for an issue like the Alberta separatist movement is that it poisons the well of honest and good faith discussion. A lot of Albertans feel marginalized by the Canadian government and have concerns they believe aren't being addressed. Whether these concerns warrant Alberta breaking off from Canada isn't for us to say. However, having people from halfway around the world use the debate as a way to stoke anger and make a few extra dollars erodes Canada's democratic system. An engagement farmer on any side of the debate has the capacity to discredit whatever issue they touch, and that does a lot more damage than the $13.89 that engagement is worth. The Alberta independence referendum is scheduled to take place on the 19th of October, and we wish the nation all the best in choosing its own destiny. This month, we wanted to check in with the nation of Cuba, which continues to struggle under a US fuel blockade. The embargo on oil to the small Caribbean island came after America's January intervention in Venezuela, which, alongside Mexico, provided Cuba with the vast majority of its oil needs. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the blockade was due to Cuba being a national security threat to the United States, as well as, quote, one of the leading sponsors of terrorism in the entire region. A deeper explanation by the White House website explains that Cuba is currently on America's shit list for being close to rival nations such as Russia, China, and Iran. Cuba has subsequently accused the United States of vilifying the nation to justify military intervention. International observers tend to agree. In a press release on the 29th of January, human rights experts for the United Nations stated, quote, "The US executive order imposing a fuel blockade on Cuba is a serious violation of international law and a grave threat to democratic and equitable international order. It is an extreme form of unilateral economic coercion with extraterritorial effects, through which the United States seeks to exert coercion on the sovereign state of Cuba and compel other sovereign third states to alter their lawful commercial relations, under threat of punitive trade measures." On the 29th of October last year, the UN held a vote on whether or not to end America's now 60-year embargo on Cuba. 165 member nations voted to end the embargo, while only 7 voted against the motion. The nations that voted against the resolution were the United States, Israel, Argentina, Hungary, Paraguay, North Macedonia, and Ukraine. Reportedly, most of these nations came under intense lobbying by the Trump campaign. Ukraine, meanwhile, was more concerned with reports that Cuban nationals were fighting alongside Russia. The vote marked the 33rd year in a row that the United Nations voted in support of lifting the blockade. Since the early 60s, the US sanctions on Cuba have severely crippled the nation's centralized economy. One study published by the Washington office on Latin America during President Biden's administration described the severity of the impact. Quote, "As a small island, Cuba is in a position where it depends on trade to survive. As a result of the complete prohibition on trade with the United States, a 2021 estimate by the Cuban government found that the embargo has cost the country close to $144 billion. A similar figure has been acknowledged by the United Nations. Gail Reed, one of the leading researchers of the study, would also describe the health impacts of the long-running embargo. Quote, "The US embargo has nefarious consequences for Cubans, jeopardizing health and the welfare of women, children, and people living with cancer or HIV/AIDS. Meanwhile, this year's oil blockade has greatly exacerbated these humanitarian issues, with frequent and long power outages making it difficult to run hospitals and keep food from spoiling." US-Cuba relations would also take another dive last month, when 94-year-old Raul Castro, brother of Fidel Castro, was indicted by the US on murder charges. In 1996, Raul Castro instructed the Cuban Air Force to shoot down 2 American planes in the strait between Cuba and Florida. The Cuban government claims they told pilots to turn around several times before shooting them down. Critics argue that murking civilian planes with fighter jets is a dick move no matter how you slice it. Raul Castro is currently considered by many as the de facto ruler of Cuba, meaning the US has effectively accused Cuba's leader of murder. With this said, if the Trump administration had hoped Cuba would move away from its communist ways, it might have actually got its wish this month. On the 19th of June, Raul Castro announced 176 measures to decentralize the Cuban economy. The new measures loosen restrictions on private businesses, allows imports and exports without state intervention, and even permits fast food chains to be set up on the island. Although having a McDonald's in Havana would serve as a huge cultural victory for America, Cuba isn't about to become a beacon of capitalism anytime soon. The nation is simply integrating more free market ingredients into its centralized economy soup. Although the Trump administration states that a regime change is their ultimate goal within Cuba, there's also been a push for providing humanitarian assistance. In late May, Cuba accepted an offer by the United States for $100 million in aid. The aid does come with a condition, however, as the US government states it's not to be distributed by the Cuban government or military. Rather, the US wants distribution to be carried out by Cuba's churches and charity groups, stating that it doesn't trust Cuban officials to get aid where it's needed. In an address directed at the Cuban people, Marco Rubio blamed Cuba's current economic problems on the Cuban government, not the United States. President Trump's focus on Cuba falls broadly within his other attempts to finalize a myriad of long-standing US conflicts. This includes his decision to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan, wind down military aid to Ukraine, yoink the president of Venezuela, and most recently, start a war with Iran. Much like Iran, President Trump rolled back diplomatic efforts by the Obama administration to get a, quote, better deal with Cuba. In President Trump's own words, quote, "Other presidents have looked at this for 50, 60 years doing something, and it looks like I'll be the one that does it. So I would be happy to do it." With another 2.5 years in office, only time will tell whether Trump's presidency will meaningfully improve US-Cuba relations. On the 12th of June, SpaceX, the American aerospace company owned by Elon Musk, completed a record-breaking initial public offering, or IPO. The initial public offering went on to be the largest for any company in history, placing just 25% of the company's equity up for purchase at an initial target share price of $135. For those of you like Swag who played Titanfall 2 during Finance 101, an initial public offering happens when a company decides to go public, and allows anyone to buy shares in the company. Going public allows companies to quickly raise huge sums of money for future expansion, and lets long-term employees cash out on their own shares. An IPO is the first day that normal, everyday investors can start buying stock. By the end of the first day of public trading, the stock would end up finishing at around $161, giving the company a $2 trillion valuation. As of time of writing, SpaceX now sits as the 8th most valuable company on Earth. In the world of finance, the SpaceX IPO was controversial, as many index funds altered their own rules to get a piece of the action. An index fund is a collection of stocks which make up a specific financial market. The S&P 500, for example, is made up of the 500 leading companies in the United States. Consequently, index funds are a staple of retirement accounts, as they're inherently diversified, have good long-term returns, and have a high standard for which companies are included. Currently, American citizens have more money invested for retirement in the S&P 500 than any other type of investment. This is where things get a bit shaky, because to get on the SpaceX IPO, many index funds decided to reduce their standard for entry. For the S&P 500, for example, their rules state that companies need to be public for 12 months before being allowed in, which is designed to mitigate the volatility that comes with an IPO. Companies also need to be profitable to join the index, and maintain that profitability for multiple quarters. SpaceX quite famously has never turned a profit, and had a net loss last quarter of $4.28 billion. Leading up to the SpaceX IPO, the S&P 500 announced that it was going to make changes to the index fund to dramatically decrease the wait period, and get rid of the profitability requirement completely. This decision faced immediate backlash by investors, as it essentially forced millions of Americans to become partial shareholders in a company which had never actually made money. It was feared that these relaxed rules could also open the door for other cash-burning businesses such as OpenAI and Anthropic, which are expected to IPO later this year. An economist we spoke to earlier this year stated that the AI bubble was the only thing keeping the United States from a full-scale recession, making investors even more nervous about relaxed index membership. Heeding these concerns, the committee running the S&P 500 made the decision to exclude SpaceX for at least a year, and begin looking at its inclusion in mid-2027. This isn't to say other funds didn't change their rules for SpaceX's inclusion, with index funds like the Nasdaq 100 and the Russell 1000 greatly shortening their normal waiting periods. Other concerns around SpaceX involve Elon Musk's other ventures. To purchase Twitter, for example, Musk got loans by using his equity in SpaceX as collateral. If Musk somehow didn't have money to pay them, these stocks would be immediately liquidated, tanking the value of the company. Another possibility is that Elon could merge SpaceX with Tesla at some point, a prospect that's been floated by SpaceX's Gwynne Shotwell. Perhaps the biggest headline from the SpaceX IPO is that it's now made Elon Musk the world's first true trillionaire, with an estimated worth of $1.4 trillion as of time of writing. To properly demonstrate how much money $1.4 trillion actually is, Swag recruited Jake the Analyst to put it into perspective. You can't blame Swag for not being able to count to a trillion after all. Most YouTubers can barely comprehend the age of consent. If you were to earn $1 every second, it would take you a little less than 32,000 years, or roughly 6 times the length of recorded human history, to earn just $1 trillion. If you were to line up every dollar of Elon Musk's wealth from end to end, it would take a little over 12 minutes traveling at the speed of light, the fastest known speed in the universe, to cover the distance that would span. For reference, the median net worth of an American household is $192,000, and moving at that same speed, it would take you 0.6 milliseconds, a time so short you wouldn't even know it happened. If you were to line up every dollar of Musk's wealth, it would be able to stretch from Earth to Mars 4 times over. In terms of what a person could do with $1.4 trillion, Jake also took the liberty to compile a little list. According to the United Nations, world hunger could be solved by 2030 for $96 billion a year, wiping all medical debt in the US, $220 billion. Solving homelessness in the US by 2030, $20 billion a year. Creating a debt-free US education system, $75 billion a year. And fixing every road and bridge in America, $68 billion a year. Perhaps the craziest part of these figures is that Elon Musk could pay for all of these things for a year and still remain a trillionaire. 1.4 trillion is higher than the GDP of 90% of nations on the planet, and it's enough money to run the entire US military for 18 months. Of course, effectively Musk doesn't have access to $1.4 trillion, as most of his fortune is tied up in a stock that's probably overinflated. Liquidating large portions of his shares would almost certainly devalue his remaining stockpile, which would further devalue his net worth. Whether Elon Musk's trillionaire status represents the pinnacle of what a person can achieve in a capitalist system, or the proof of unsustainable wealth inequality, is all in the eye of the beholder. Only time will tell what Musk plans to do while living his life in creative mode. As a well-earned treat for making it this far, let's cover something fun. The UFC fight at the White House. First announced by President Trump in July 2025, the event is to commemorate 250 years since America's Declaration of Independence. Due to logistical reasons, the actual 4th of July date wasn't possible for the event, leaving organizers to move the date to the 14th of June. This date, coincidentally, is both Flag Day and President Trump's 80th birthday. Although initial estimates by the president predicted around 20 to 25,000 attendees, security concerns reduced this number to an estimated 4,300. Attendance to the event on the White House's South Lawn was strictly invite-only, with invitations given out by the UFC, the White House, and a large segment reserved for military personnel. Security concerns by the Secret Service would later be validated 4 days before the event, when the FBI thwarted an attempted terror attack involving drones armed with explosives. However, security also had to thwart attempts by UFC middleweight champion Sean Strickland to enter the event, who was immediately mobbed by fans while sneaking in. The 35-year-old claimed that he, quote, wasn't cleared by the White House because he made fun of Israel and Epstein. Strickland was later charged with disorderly conduct, to which he later commented, I don't know what that is, but it sounds cool. Within the event grounds, the UFC and its partners had plenty to keep the attendees busy. Meta, for example, held a booth which created AI-generated fight posters and offered virtual tours of a locker room. However, the headline use of AI at the event was a promotional video exploring America's long history of combat, spanning from the Revolutionary War to the modern day. We'd love to show you the video, but by the time it came to edit this story, it had been removed from all White House and UFC channels. In fact, it seemingly vanished from the internet altogether. With this said, the official White House YouTube channel recently started posting a series of AI-generated history videos, and fortunately they're very similar to the now removed UFC ad. Here's a little snippet for those interested.
Lousy bloody back! Can't even pay your debts!
In the name of the king, step back.
You'll not have this street. Out with ye.
There was also an ad by the US Department of War before the main event. Although likely not the intention, the ad looked a lot like the trailer to a movie about the US wanting to conquer the world. We'll play that during the outro if anyone is interested. Other sponsors included Monster Energy Drinks, which handed out free cans of their new commemorative flavor, Red, White, and Blue Raz. For many attendees, this was a welcome change from the $4 cans of water, or the $12 Bud Lights, which also sponsored the event. Other sponsors included Starlink, Ram, Stake, Crypto.com, Polymarket, and sports apparel company Fanatics. There were also ads for real Trump coins, commemorative UFC medallions priced between $250 to $12,000. Another sponsor was President Trump's family crypto company, World Liberty Financial, which has been repeatedly criticized for conflict of interest concerns. It was estimated that it cost the UFC approximately $60 million to host the event, with sponsors recouping roughly half these costs. As for the fights themselves, the night marked the only UFC event in history to have all fights end by knockout. Justin Gaethje ended up being the main event for the night, beating Ilia Topuria for the lightweight title for the first time in his decade-spanning career. Commenting on his tour of the White House, Gaethje would comment, quote, "It was pretty crazy looking at the Declaration of Independence, the original one. Their language was different. I'm not smart enough to read that." However, the night's most unhinged comment came from heavyweight Josh Hokett. Hokett celebrated his win by thanking President Trump, comparing Jesus Christ to the Incredible Hulk and commenting that former First Lady Michelle Obama was a man. Reception to the event was mixed, with polling before the event finding that even among Republicans, many US adults didn't think the White House was an appropriate UFC venue. Others argued that fights hosted at the People's House should have been at least free for the people to watch. Meanwhile, classics professor at Cornell University Mike Fontaine likened the event to gladiatorial games in Rome. In his own words, quote, "This is all a distraction. This is a classic strategy. In ancient Rome, the phrase would be bread and circuses." The White House itself tended to be a lot less cynical, with the spokesperson calling the event one of the most entertaining nights in American history. Regardless of how someone might feel about President Trump, he's proven himself to be a showman first and foremost, with the event featuring motocross jumps over the South Fountain, a fighter jet flyover, and 7 separate knockouts. Despite criticism, the UFC event at the White House was arguably the single best way to celebrate America's modern culture on its 250th birthday. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Patreon if you want to help us out, and until next time, have a fucking good one.
America's military is unmatched. Projecting power, denying passage to adversaries, and protecting our interest at the time and place of our choosing. America is winning.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into. It's called peace through strength. Every branch of our armed forces is setting records for recruitment. Through our power and might, we will lead the world to peace. Our friends will respect us, our enemies will fear us, and the whole world will admire the unrivaled greatness of the United States military. If you attack the United States of America, we will hunt you down and we will find you.
Decisively, devastatingly, and without mercy.
God bless you, God bless our armed forces, God bless our men and women serving overseas, and God bless the United States of America.